Hey everybody, welcome to Let's Play, and today we're going to be talking about the writing for Slay the Princess with its creators from Black Tabby Games, Tony Arias and Abby Howard. It's so great to see you both. Thanks for joining me.
Great to be here.
Thank you so much for having us.
Oh, of course. I'm really excited to talk about this game. Where did the idea for the game come from, and kind of why did you decide to structure it in the way that you did?
Like a lot of, I guess, successful art, a lot of the pieces of Slay the Princess came together from sort of the constraints we had to work with. So it sort of started as what is a second project we can do to keep ourselves going while our other project, Scarlet Hollow, finishes its very long development cycle. I think Scarlet Hollow will, from start to finish, be like a 5 or 6 year game, which is a lot of time to spend on your first game.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. And a lot of money that you need to make to keep your lights on and pay rent and eat food.
And of course, you had just a spark of an idea that just kind of quickly just rolled into what it became.
But the constraints here were what is a setting that we could do that's less demanding art-wise?
Yeah. So all of it is hand drawn by me. So I'm one person, and it takes me a while to draw.
Yeah.
So
our workflow for the other game was such that I had a couple months where I was just doing marketing in between our releases for it. So we're really looking at what's a story we can tell with not a ton of characters, focused on one location. That very, very quickly came into what if you are forced to interact with someone that you're told is going to end the world or is very dangerous, but you're not given any evidence for it, with the core conceit here being the person is actually a monster that takes the form of what you believe them to be. So it's a scenario where other people can't be around, where you've been given kind of incomplete information, but then also where the decisions you make can change the narrative and allow for agency and exploration.
Yep. And all of that blossomed out of the what if there's only one character on screen versus the many characters that we have with our other game, and it's one location. So that's kind of
And of course that became something where you go to a cabin from the woods every chapter, but it's a different cabin, so it has to be entirely redrawn.
Yeah, so effectively, it's not in fact
the character changes into a completely different form, so she's entirely redrawn, etc., etc.
But it's all done in pencil on smaller paper than I'm used to working on, so that made it much easier and much faster to draw. And it lent itself to a very interesting style that I think kind of stands out.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, I did want to ask you, Abby, so you said you drew it you hand drew everything and you converted that, I guess, did you scan it or something and then do something in a computer? How exactly did that work?
Yeah, it's all pencil on paper. With our other project, it's ink on paper, and then I scan it in with my big scanner and digitally edit the files to be in a game. And also I usually add shading at that point, so.
I do like a lot of the subtle animation going on as well. Were you kind of doing that frame by frame animation, or is that something with a computer program?
I asked her to do that, and then she just
it's something we did for our other project, where I drew every image of a flickering guy 3 times to make that work. And it meant that I spent 3 times as much time as I should have on that art.
Yeah,
so it's an effect that you can use.
Yeah, with the magic of video games lets you tell a computer to do things with pixels that are already in an illustration. So we worked with a contractor to design just a computerized boil effect to mimic traditional animation there, where it's everything looks like it's been very slightly redrawn a dozen times a second.
Yeah, I've used something like that in After Effects before, where it gives you that kind of warbly shifting effect.
We started doing it in After Effects, and then that started to kill everyone's CPUs. Visual Novel, which is supposed to be the easiest type of game to run, was struggling with older machines, so we had to learn something else.
And still struggles because there's too much art in the game for some people's computers to handle.
Okay.
Oh, really?
I firmly hold the belief that if you own a 13-year-old laptop, you cannot have any expectations that it will run anything released like now. I understand the desire to sort of force that, but it's like, you know, every few years processors change, operating systems change, things fall out of fashion.
I think it definitely paid off though, going with that art style though, because I think it just adds so much character to it when you're playing. Since there is so much visualization in the game, and then of course you have the writing of all these different voices, and a lot of times the voices are sort of reiterating what the player is seeing. I'm curious how that kind of process worked from the both of you. Like, did you write scenes first and then have like storyboards or art to go with it? What was the kind of dynamic when you were working together on that?
So I would write the first draft of everything. Abby would go in, do her edits,
including saying, "This will not work art.
I can't draw this." Are you for real?
This will be like changing scenes mid-sentence is something that has to get fixed a lot, where like two actions will happen in one sentence, which means that then two things would have to happen on screen.
Works great in prose.
It does.
But
not so much when you have to actually show what's happening.
So there's like, and I think that because so much of like the core concept of the game is around the way perception shapes reality and your relationships with other people, I think that there's a lot to be gained from like script kind of gets handed off. We come up with a list of things, but then it's Abby's interpretation of what happened in those words.
Yeah, that wound up changing some amount of the actual text. So
yeah.
Where did the kind of idea come from where you would have these different, I guess, voices that would interject, and also you have obviously the narrator who's kind of trying to direct the player in a particular direction, and you have this like really interesting back and forth where all these different voices are trying to like persuade you to behave a certain way, and they're often antagonistic towards each other.
So it came from a core challenge, which was, if the princess is like a perception monster, if she changes based on the player's beliefs around her at a given moment, how do we as game makers articulate and figure out what those beliefs are in a way that doesn't break immersion, right? So it's like the earliest solution of this. Sorry, our cat is being a menace.
That's okay.
The earliest concept was like, oh, you're going into the basement, and then very clunkily the game / narrator kind of probes you and is like, what do you think you're gonna find out there? And then it would reveal that, and instead it felt much tighter to have a representation of like the player's thoughts that can express that, and that can spin off of the ideas, the dialogue options the player is taking, to be like, well, the game says it's this. And we found in our...
It's kind of like reflecting your actions back at you, trying to show the part of you that kind of led you to make this choice.
Yeah. And like there was some inspiration from the voices in Disco Elysium there, but more of a like, well, we have this really difficult problem to solve that the entire concept of the game hinges on. What tools are there possibly to solve this? And then remembering, oh, right, they did something here where like parts of your character's psyche are their own characters. So let's roll with that and see where it goes.
We've also seen through Scarlet Hollow or other game, the way that just a line of dialogue can influence the player.
Yeah, we run surveys at the end of every episode, and for anyone unfamiliar with how Scarlet Hollow is structured, it's like an episodic game where there's an overarching narrative, but each episode has like a little horror vignette that ties into that overarching narrative, and you have like a big, almost like Telltale or Life is Strange style decision where there's like kind of a binary being offered to you. It's two terrible options. You're supposed to be introspective about like what your values are as a player when you're confronted with something out of the ordinary. And we noticed when we would run surveys about people's decisions after episodes for like balance patches and stuff, that there was like this really strong correlation of whoever got the last word in as an NPC before a decision, that's who the players would go with, like to the point where, you know, it was like an 80-20 split. And this became evident in the third episode of Scarlet Hollow, where you can go through this entire climactic sequence with one of two characters, depending on your choices, and they each want you to do something different for the final decision. And we got to our data and it was like, oh, we almost had a 50-50 split. That kicks ass. And I cut it to look at, well, what's the split for each character? It's like, oh, well, this character who says you should do option A, 80% of the people with that character, they go with option A, and the opposite for the other. So it was a lesson that we've been able to apply to our other writing.
Yeah, that rings very true. I think, like, obviously recency bias is a very real thing in many different areas.
Yeah.
Did you have a particular voice that you enjoyed writing for the most, or maybe one that was particularly challenging?
I have very fond feelings about both. The voice of the opportunist, who's a slimy little butthole, and I love him for it. And the voice of the cheated was like the one tied to the Razor Root, which was the last route we did for the game when we were both kind of over it. So kind of creating him as an expression of our, can we be done with this already? This is so bullshit, was very fun. I think it like brought a lot of joy to the root.
I liked writing the Broken, which a lot of people don't like the Broken because he's very sad. He's very miserable and he brings bad energy into the room. And it's just fun to write that kind of guy, though. But I also really enjoyed writing for the Opportunist or editing for the Opportunist.
The Broken has been an interesting challenge with the like director's cut that we're doing for this fall, because we put a lot of work into being like, how can we make him suck less? Can we turn perception around so that he still sucks, but it may be a little more of an...
I suppose a different way to phrase it is, how do we add more dimension to his character? That's more like...
That's another way to put it, yeah.
Yeah. Like, how do we make him into a more fleshed out kind of character who isn't just there to say, we should give up. We should roll over and die, I think.
To be clear, he is still like that in... all of the base content that's in the game.
Yeah, and especially the chapter where he rears his head. Like most of the chapters where the voices show up for the first time,
they're at their worst.
They're at their worst.
Yeah. And that was a leftover of an earlier concept for the story, where instead of this sort of like Rashomon or like spoke type style, you would just go through one princess with many, many iterations. And it's like your voice would be at his worst the first time you got him, and you would evolve over time, and finally
like the princess does.
Yeah, you would finally like break through into something else. So we kind of kept that into the final release, where the chapter 2 iteration of each voice is them at their worst, and then they can grow from there, or they can be more helpful in other people's routes as they come in later. But I don't know, it's fun to explore characters who make things more difficult.
Yeah, since you did bring up the director's cut, what can you tell us about that in terms of what you're planning to add to the game?
Have we said the percentage? Are we allowed to say?
Yeah, we've said the percent. So it extends the game by about 35%.
Oh, wow.
Don't quote me on that exact number, but like every single thing, it's like we look at the number of voice files, it's about 35% more. We look at the number of art assets, it's about 35% more, etc., etc. So there were like 3 chapters in the base version of the game that felt kind of underbaked. I think, again, holdovers from earlier concepts of what the story would be, and Slated Princess was a very fast turnaround game in general.
Yeah, that's actually where some of the art miscommunications came in, where some of the chapters felt more complete because I kind of finished the arc in the art more than Tony wanted it to be finished.
Yeah. Originally, like, the hands were going to ship, like, grab a princess before you got any resolution, but like right before you got it. But then Abby drew like...
Well, there was some language such as
it's better.
strikes true.
Yeah. Yeah,
finish her, and I'm like, oh, okay, you stab her. And so I would draw you stabbing her and ending the chapter, and you were like, you're not supposed to stab her. And I'm like, well, we have the art now.
we have the art now. And then every time I saw it, I was like, oh, this game.
And it's good art. It feels good to look at a resolution.
So there were a few that got just like very stuck in that earlier version of the concept that we wanted to flesh out. So that's the Fury, which is very short. You meet her and she like unwinds your entire body instantly.
Her new chapter. And I mean, she always was a favorite of mine, of course.
Yeah.
I'm a big Hellraiser guy.
But it's like one of the things with her too is she's like the third chapter in the game that has like 5 different access points that are all thematically different. So it's like in this one I think she has the longest chapter in the game now because we get to explore all of the different access points and what those mean. So it's like her chapter is 5 to 6 times bigger content-wise than the base version of the game.
And of course, you won't see necessarily all of that. So
No.
I guess you'll just have to play it a little
Many times.
to see everything. And there's the Apotheosis who comes from the tower.
Mhm.
And that's her chapter 3.
Another, she appears and then it's over.
Yeah.
And then the Den, which comes from the Beast, which is again she sort of appears, you do a brief thing. That one had a little more closure than the others, but we found some very fun ways to extend it and wrap it up.
Yeah, make it more satisfying, make it
That
more of
one.
a character.
And then there was also like a pattern where it's like a lot of princesses, they would have like their standalone chapter 3 and one that joins with another route. And there were 4 princesses that didn't have a standalone chapter 3. There's the Spectre, the Damsel, and the Prisoner, and also the Stranger. The Stranger kind of like is hard. Conceptually, you can't build on her, and she gets her own unique ending if she's your first princess. But for the other 3, we were like, oh, we can even this out, and let's just give them new chapters. And we found some really, really fun themes to explore there.
And of course, we didn't just sit there and say, let's give them new chapters, but it just kind of finally realized what we could do and kind of the points where it could happen.
We were pretty committed when we released that we were not going to add anything else, that it was over. People, when we did a Reddit AMA a couple weeks after release, were like begging us for DLC, and we were like, no, we said everything that we had to say. But then we
was like, well, I did have a thought for a Damsel chapter 3. Wouldn't this be neat? And just playing around. We're not doing it because we're so tired and we don't want to. But here we are.
Yeah. I think we wound up doing something different for the Damsel one,
We
right?
like kind of branched
It
up.
evolved.
It evolved a lot. Mine was much more grim and just so it's less grim and miserable. It's more emotional than what
I think it's going to wreck people. I think
Yes.
that one in
I think it's
particular
there's
is
a lot
going
more
to,
than
like,
the miserable chapter I was.
yeah, no,
actually.
it's very good. Very happy with it.
That sounds amazing. Yeah, I can't wait to check that out. I was very interested in also all the different visual iterations that the princess goes through. Was there any inspiration? Was there any particular process that kind of guided how you decided to characterize visually how the princess would look in all these various different scenarios?
It's very hard to describe how things like these designs came about. It was, I suppose, just the wealth of kind of experience that I have of things I've read, things I've watched that have influenced me in some capacity.
Very vibe space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I would just keep sketching until something felt correct.
With the exception, so there's like the 2 human-ish iterations of the princess, the damsel, the prisoner. Those were just kind of like
We're
easy
doing
enough.
an anime one.
Right.
We're
right.
doing
We're
the
like
depressed one with more chains than
we're exploring like kind of more human dimensions to them, but it's like all of the others were, well, what's the vibe of the relationship that got you to this place, and what can we pull from in terms of like folklore, pop culture, horror, just the horror genre in general to align with what happened up to this point.
It's like I just like weird pattern seeking, pattern forming. I think the Thorn is probably the one where I remember the process the most, because we knew that we had to have a chapter 3 there, and we knew it had to have certain themes. So then I just kind of thought about all of the fairy tales that had similar themes, which I think, or even just kind of a similar vibe. Like, it's not even like this one, the Seven Swans, I think is the one where a girl's brothers get turned into swans and she has to knit a bunch of sweaters for them out of thistles. And that's how she can make them back into people. And for some reason, that just stuck out to me as what she should be based around. So that's kind of where the thorns come from.
And like she's coming from the witch who already has like a fae adjacent
Exactly.
aesthetic.
So then that kind of influenced me going specifically for fairy tales versus anything else. Because, of course, there are other ones that aren't necessarily fairy tales so much as like horror and fantasy. It kind of depends on where it came from. And then there are some where there are fusions of princesses. So I had to draw from both of their chapters and also like take a new spin on it. The Wraith is a good example of that, where it has to be a ghost because of the way that you get there, but has to be distinct from all the other ghosts in the game.
We have a lot of ghosts.
We have a lot of ghosts.
If you like,
And she's really mad at you. So I was just like, well, of course, it's a Wraith, naturally.
From just an overall creation of the game perspective, what would you say were some of the big lessons that you learned that you're, looking to apply in the future?
voice editing is really labor intensive.
Yeah.
It's really. I think so. There's no way we're adding voice acting to Scarlet Hollow. People ask us all the time, but like that script when it's done is going to be something like 1.3 million words, I think, and it's just.
And a big reason we never did it in the first place is because people have an idea in their heads of how these characters should sound, and if we added voice acting now, it wouldn't sound right to people. It absolutely would not.
Yeah, I think like for a third game, we would probably try and scope it around voice acting. So many things with Scarlet Hollow 2 would be retroactively very difficult to add it in, scope aside.
But it makes it like more accessible to people. People find it interesting. You can like make your lines more easily interpretable because somebody is reading them out. So.
But I would say, because like the lessons framing of this question is really interesting, I feel like we learned fewer lessons from Slay the Princess so much as like it wound up being the culmination of a lot of lessons we learned about making Scarlet Hollow. Like figuring out the areas where in Scarlet Hollow the scope like got very out of hand, and we're always happy to like really grind through scope and making things big and reactive. But like we learned from that, how do we make a smaller project that's still thematically tight and allows for this exploration? We also learned how to make a project that's easier to talk about. I think Scarlet Hollow is a game that I often describe it as I've never had a pitch for it that is shorter than like a paragraph and a half. And it's like when you look for anything, right? People have short attention spans. You have to hook them immediately. There's this word of advice that I see a lot about like a beginner mistake people make with their first indie game trailers, where they like spend the first 2 seconds like showing their studio logo that no one has heard of before that slow fades into something else. And it's like,
We did that.
you did that?
Yeah.
And by the time that studio logo appears, someone has already clicked onto the next thing.
Yeah.
So, that was a central component. Like, how do you make something that's easier to talk about, which also like it almost sounds like we're mostly talking about marketing, but so much of this too is like, how do you get someone to immediately connect with the ideas and the vibe of the story you're trying to tell, the aesthetic you're trying to portray? So it's like it really goes hand in hand.
Yeah, no, I think in Slay the Princess that totally rings true because, like you mentioned, like everything is very bite-sized in a way, right? Like all the little pieces of dialogue, all the little options that you select, it's like you get like an immediate little feedback and little resolution. So it kind of, it's almost like addictive in a way, like, oh, you want to see like what the next thing is. And I think even as you like start to sort of wrap your head around what the game is doing with the different chapters and the cycles, you can sort of feel like at least like where it's going in terms of like the rhythm of the game in a way, even though obviously it goes in very unexpected ways. So I think that at least for me, it definitely like, it was very hard for me to like stop playing because I always wanted to know like what the next kind of like cycle is going to look like.
And it's only going to take you like half an hour.
Yeah, true. I did really like the sound design in the game as well. I'm curious how technically you went about doing that. Did you use like mostly libraries, or was there anything else that you did
We
to?
have a guy.
Oh, nice.
So we work with Phil Mikulski on sound, who worked with our he works with our composer on like anything our composer works on too. Like they have that sort of thing where it's like when one of them gets a job, they will try and take the other guy with them. So it's like he has a mixture of, he'll find things from libraries, but then in both of our games, there are a lot of like gory sequences where we're like, okay, no, we need these really, really specific things. I'm so sorry, Phil, but you do need to figure out what a degloving would sound like.
Yes, I believe he does Foley work.
Yeah, he does.
I think he did some of the sounds for a part where where the beast eats you alive and you dissolve.
Yeah,
I think it's soda or something.
it's soda, and I think it might have been cooking.
Yeah, cooking.
Oh, nice. For people that really enjoyed Slay the Princess, do you have any books or maybe other pieces of media that sort of capture the same spirit in a way that you think they would also enjoy?
House of Leaves. I think that's a big one. I like, in terms of games, I have a broken record of recommending Disco Elysium whenever I can. I think it is peerless in the narrative game space. God, I feel like there's some animes that.
Yeah,
Oh.
anime I think is probably, I can't remember which ones though. As for books, I read a lot of nonfiction, so
All right.
I don't think any nonfiction would apply here unless it's too awful for most people to read.
Yeah, for me, it's funny you mentioned Disco Elysium, and yeah, I totally see the parallels there with the different, I forget what they're called in Disco Elysium. They're like your different skills or attributes
I
that
think
are
they're
all.
just all the skills, right? Because the thought
Yeah.
cabinet is a different,
Yeah.
like the ideas you and internalize.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I absolutely love Disco Elysium.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's sort of, because I know a lot of people compare that game from like stylistically to this author China Miéville, who kind of writes a lot of like weird speculative fiction. And I think there's like people that like Slay the Princess might also like him as well.
I'll have to check them out.
Yeah, definitely. There's this one book I'm reading now called The Kraken, which is about, it's like in London, and there's this like marine biology kind of museum, and they have this like giant squid exhibit, and it just goes like missing one day. And it's like a police procedural like into that. It's really like has that like absurdist kind of British quality to it, I guess.
Oh, anime recommendations. I feel like Madoka is a good rec there.
Yeah, I mean, if anyone hasn't seen Madoka, you got it.
I feel like for Madoka watchers, the themes are immediately obvious, but would be a spoiler if I discuss them here. And I think it's best to go into that one on foot. It's a 12-episode miniseries. It is so tight. It wraps itself up so neatly, and then they did a spin-off movie that unwrapped it up, and it bothers me to this day. I'm really excited for the next movie that's launching this fall that might re-tie everything back up just so I can rest easy and not be one of those people who's like, well, the mainline series is what's canon, and none of the other stuff is.
Yeah, so I guess for both of you, how would you describe your own kind of creative journey and how that eventually led to you both working in video games?
Should we start with your more fun journey or my more boring journey?
With yours.
All right, great. So, let's see. I studied screenwriting and psychology in college. Did a lot of writing there, and then not a whole lot professionally came out of that. My whole thing in undergrad was I was planning to go to law school so I could study whatever seemed the most fun. And then I started law school and hated it and dropped out in like 2 weeks, and wound up pivoting to like working in data analytics and marketing for first a couple tech startups, and then the Boston Globe, and then another tech startup with some friends that did not work out super well. And eventually, like, Abby and I happened to be at a like simultaneous career crossroads, and going into making games seemed like an interesting next step. And her career is so much more interesting than mine.
I always really liked to make comics. That was the thing that I always wanted to do with my life. I wound up going to university for evolutionary biology, which was not comics because I didn't think that comics was going to make me any money. So I thought I should probably go into something. I should go into something that would be more of a safe kind of career path, which evolutionary biology is not actually a safe career path whatsoever. Becoming a scientist is very difficult. It is very similar actually to being a freelancer. So turns out that those are basically the same thing. But I wound up making comics anyway. My grades suffered for that for sure, but my comics took off. So it all worked out in the end. I was doing webcomics at first, which is, I had Junior Scientist Power Hours, my first one, which is just kind of a gag comic, but it also had a little bit of a horror tilt just because that's the kind of person I've always been. Both sides of my family are horror people, so I just inherited that for sure. So then I started The Last Halloween, which was my second webcomic, and that one is on hiatus for now, but it will come back. And that one was all horror, but also funny. And then I did a series, Earth Before Us, which tapped into the evolutionary biology that I know. So it was for kids, and it was about early life on Earth. And then I did The Crossroads at Midnight with Iron Circus Comics, which was just horror. I was done at that point with anything that wasn't horror. And then we did Scarlet Hollow. So that's my career.
What about games makes them special in terms of being a conduit for storytelling or communicating, different ideas?
They're extremely unique from like any other kind of medium because the player character is a central character and you have to understand what that means. Like knowing that the person who clicks those buttons is going to be an actual person and predicting what they're going to do and trying to guide them through a story is such an interesting problem, but it also means that people will be able to connect with it in a way they might not be able to connect with other things. Like people can absolutely connect with different kinds of media, like fully and completely, but the kind of connection that you have with the game is definitely unique. And I think it's also part of why it's really hard to adapt games for other kind of media.
Yeah.
Because you have to decide who the player character is.
And it's like, they're such a tactile thing. And I feel like because we talk a lot on interviews about how different games are from other written mediums because of the interactivity, but I think that something that never gets stressed enough is like, I feel like when someone hears that, they're like, oh, well, you're talking about like choice-based games where you make a guy and then you click dialogue options, but it's like, it's the whole experience and how you feel being in someone else's shoes, even if like you don't pick any dialogue options for that character, even if they are a predetermined, fully written entity. Like I think the Last of Us is an example I think about a lot there, because there are things about the story in that first game where the shoes they put you in at a given moment, who you're controlling, changes the way a scene plays out and is perceived in a way that like
being a watcher of that is a different experience than being the person who is making the decisions, even if the decisions are a straight line.
Yeah, like they did a very good job with the show, but like there is a je ne sais quoi that is lost for me, the ending of that first game, where suddenly you are playing as a different character, and because of that, the words that are being spoken just hit differently.
And I think this is also something where you can play with the same kind of ideas in other media as well. Like changing perspective characters in books can have a huge impact. Just having a character at some point show that you've been the character's been an unreliable narrator the whole time, like making you question everything that you've read so far. It's definitely not something unique to games. However, it is something that plays out very, very differently in a game.
Yeah, like it's not, oh, this character I care about has been bamboozled. It's me. I'm the one who was bamboozled here. I'm the one who has a changing relationship.
Absolutely, yeah. I know you mentioned The Last of Us. Were there any other games that were really informative for both of you in terms of, I guess, developing your creative sensibilities, or really just like inspiring you in terms of the potential for storytelling in games?
I guess the question is like, when in our lives, because there's a bunch of stuff that I could point to as being formative when I was a teen and young adult. There's also stuff I could still point to as being formative now. Like the younger me stuff was very 2000s era BioWare influenced. I would say like Dragon Age Origins in particular was like, I think that was like my first giant RPG, and I was so compelled by the depth of the world building and the way they set up dilemmas there, and a little frustrated at how many easy outs they provided people for scenarios that I thought were just like really, really interesting thought experiments to force people through. So like that's a major component. I've already mentioned Disco Elysium 5 times on this interview, but that's a recent one. There's like a whole smattering of like kind of more recent stuff that, I don't know, feels like even though we're in our 30s now, still has an impact. Soma had a huge impact on me. Really, really compelling exploration of deeply unsettling existential themes. Perfect Tides, deeply, deeply compelling, like poetic introspection on what it means to grow up. I've been talking too much, Abby.
What Remains of Edith Finch is definitely one of those where I think we played that either early on in Scarlet Hollow development or before.
I think it was before.
Yeah. So that one, the way it told its story and the story it had to tell were very compelling to me. It's kind of the intersection of, I'd say it's definitely a horror game, and the sadness that was present in so much of it. I really love that intersection.
Yeah, absolutely. And was it Soma that you said earlier? Was that the game? Yes.
Soma's really big for both.
I love that game. Yeah, that was really great. And yeah, What Remains of Edith Finch, I think is fantastic. That's another one where it kind of, I guess, it also plays with point of view, but it also plays with like genre too, which I love how they kind of play with that.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah, great games. So Abby, since you have a comic book background, I'm interested in what you think, since comic books have such a big presence in the video game industry now, with so many obviously like comic book characters being adapted or different stories. What is your approach with trying to take the essence, I guess, of like comic books or a comic book style and putting that into a video game environment?
It came pretty naturally because so much of the work that I do is very similar. I draw characters on backgrounds and I make a story go. So it was a little bit of a figuring out what the limitations were going to be with the game, where for Scarlet Hollow, which was our first foray into it, I had to learn to make everything first-person perspective, and you can't touch anything because the main character never gets seen ever. So I can't show you interacting with anything. I just have to kind of still make you feel immersed, because I definitely wanted to bring over from comics kind of the energy and the just the feeling that things were happening in front of you. I wanted to make sure that it felt that way versus kind of being very static and telling you that things are happening, but never showing you that those are happening. Because I feel it can kind of take you out of the story if you read that something is happening on the screen, but it's just still images and it's the same ones that have been there the whole time. Like I understand that it's limitations, but at the same time, I wanted to try to make it a little bit more fluid, a little bit more engaging. So that's something I carried over, and then had to rein in some of my more fun tendencies, like warping backgrounds a lot, which is something I do in comics to kind of make it really energetic, to show you that things are moving. Characters had to be within your field of view, and I couldn't just cut to them and make dramatic shots. So they also had to be sprites, and learning how to do sprites took a little bit, because I had to figure out how to just edit the same image over and over again such that it was consistent, which with comics, you don't need to be that consistent. Yeah. At least at indie comics, which is where I worked.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. Are there any comic books that are exclusively from like a first-person perspective?
There must be.
I assume there must be. Somebody must have played with this before. I know I did one after starting Scarlet Hollow, but yeah, it was interesting. With Slay the Princess, at least, there is a main character who has a body, so I could show his arms on things, and that was much, much easier to work with.
And the world not obeying the standard rules of reality is helpful too.
It was a little bit more comic-y. I was kind of able to stretch my wings a bit just because the world itself is so surreal that I could do basically anything I wanted with the backgrounds after a certain point. It was pretty fun.
Is there any advice that you would give to someone who's looking to make their first game?
Start small. I think like the best thing to do, especially if you don't have a bunch of projects in other creative fields under your belt, is to finish something.
And for us, like, Scarlet and Hollow still isn't finished, but we did finish episode 1 before doing anything. We finished episode 1, 2, 3, 4. Like, we've gone and done those, but having something finished, polished, and saying to yourself, I have done this much.
Well, also before that, you'd finished like 7 or 8 books. I'd finished the screenplay. I think it's like fundamentally, it is so easy to not understand how easy it is to underestimate the scope of things, how difficult it is to bring something to a conclusion. And one of the hardest things about finishing things is throughout the process of any creative work, you are going to improve and change as an artist. And it's so easy when you reach roughly the end to be like, oh, but I could make the beginning so much better now. Let me just do that. And then you go through the whole thing again.
That's away.
You've changed again. It's like oftentimes it's improvement, especially like as you're getting started, because there's so much room for that.
But sometimes you're just moving words around.
Sometimes you've just changed. Sometimes you like the feel of this sentence less now than you did then, and it was a perfectly fine sentence. You got to learn how to finish things.
And there's definitely something that happens once you've finished a few projects or 1 or 2 projects where it just feels more doable. You understand what your skills are. You understand what you want to do and what you don't want to do. And you just feel like you can finish things. And it's a huge hurdle the first time of just working on something and working on something and working on something forever. And kind of always being able to hold in your heart that by the end of it, it will be perfect and people will love it. Because it's scary to release something into the world, to make yourself vulnerable, to show people part of yourself and to show them what you've been working on. It's a little scary, but it's never going to be as bad as you think it's going to be.
And I also think it's very important to work on something that you want to work on.
Yeah, I see some people fall into a trap of basically choosing a few buzzwords and saying, okay, I'll make something around this, like just a few concepts because you think that those sell, versus making something because you're driven to make it. And I think that sometimes you can feel that in the art itself, whether or not someone was really passionate about it or was just exploring an idea because it was popular.
Yeah, and like the fastest you'll ever reasonably make a game is maybe a year. It'll probably take longer than that. And there's this phenomenon where a lot of people, they try and follow trends because they think that that's how they make something that's marketable.
Yeah, no one is buying this kind of game. They're all buying this kind of game. I have to make this.
But by the time a trend is popular enough to be a trend, it's already over, right? This is the common truth in life. I went to law school. By the time everyone knew going to law school was like a good way to secure a stable, normal financial future for yourself, it was... there were too many lawyers and not enough jobs, to the point where like it changed the entire industry, right? Like as soon as something is public knowledge as like this is a good field to get into, this is a good kind of thing to make, it's too late. And I think it's better to follow your gut and to do something that you're passionate about, as long as you are mindful of the scope of the project and don't sink yourself into spending like 5 years on your first game.
I think that's amazing advice. Thanks for that. Is there a book or maybe a comic book or graphic novel that you think would actually make a really good video game adaptation?
It's so hard to think about adaptations because you never know what's going to get translated. It kind of depends on who adapts it. Mm-hmm. Like sometimes an adaptation can be wildly different than the source material, and I feel that's often the best kind of adaptation versus trying to tell the same story in a new format.
Right. Like I mentioned House of Leaves as something similar-ish to Slay the Princess, and it's like for those deeply in the know about weird stuff, there was this Doom mod that came out last year for the original Doom called Minehouse.wat, which is essentially an adaptation of House of Leaves built in the Doom engine. Wildly different from the book, but it's like that worked.
It's
because,
like you could tell.
Yeah.
You could feel how much of an adaptation.
Right.
it
It's
was.
like they understood the assignment.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's hard to tell. I do think that there is a challenge with video games specifically, where just in general, the cross medium adaptations in both directions really struggle. Where it's like the best case scenario of adapting a video game into something else is you lose a little something, but maybe you can make something that's still pretty good in its own right. And I don't know. It's hard to put something into a video game without changing the source material. I loved when I was growing up that the Lord of the Rings Return of the King game, that little like hack and slash co-op beat 'em up thing.
Yeah.
But it's like
Not exactly. Like,
the content of the Lord of the Rings changes when Samwise Gamgee murks 50 orcs running up to rescue Frodo, right? It's different.
Yeah, so it changes his character a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think some of my favorite, even like film adaptations from popular books, are the ones that take it in like completely different directions, like, you know, things like Apocalypse Now, or even like 10 Things I Hate About You or something like that.
oh yeah. Wait, but I did have an answer actually.
Oh, yeah,
for
go
the
for it.
adapting Books of Blood as like a horror anthology game where you have to play through a bunch of stuff like what is the game I'm thinking of? Where you wake up in the hospital. That one.
Oh, Stories
Untold. Doing a Stories Untold with Books of Blood. Like imagine, I think Books of Blood is the one where there's the two towns that are cursed to fight each other all the time, but it's that all of the people form a giant guy and then they have to fight each other as the giant guys.
Fast.
You can easily do that in a video game. You play as one of the people in the giant guy. Maybe you have to control different limbs. Sounds hard anyway, but like you can do it with that. You can have a very different kind of story with many of the other. Anyway, sorry. See, that would be fun.
No, I love that as well. Is there any existing video game universe that you would love to tell stories in?
I like doing original IP.
Yeah, I can't say it's ever crossed my mind, like working on something else. I usually have to be like driven to write something.
Yeah.
In order to do it. So I don't tend to like entertain, if I were to work here, maybe. Like I really like Clive Barker in general. So
There are like Hellraiser.
yeah, there's Hellraiser games. I could try.
Games for a while.
Yeah, he did. I feel I could probably do something better in the Hellraiser universe than I could in his video game.
Yeah, but
But
you know, that raises the question of, would you rather do something in the Hellraiser universe where you're operating under someone else's rules? And it's like, I feel like there's this thing where
I would probably take it pretty wildly off the rails.
Yeah, once you get a few generations removed from the like source material, right? Like it kind of feels fan fiction.
And that's what it would be. So,
yeah. Though I will say, give Abby the rights to do the next Digimon game.
oh my God. Why didn't I think? Digimon. They like to, like, for one thing, the rules are never consistent in Digimon. You can do whatever you want with Digimon. And also, you can write really upsetting stories in Digimon. They let you do that.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think, like, is there...
Give me a horror game that's Digimon with the Digimon guys.
There you go. That's
Digimon is
interesting.
walking forward. And he's like, Taichi, this sucks. This is terrible.
Yeah, I suppose, like, I don't think I would want to work in this setting, but I feel like the Myth series that Bungie did, like, way before Halo,
Yeah.
a couple of, like, all-time classic RTSs that the IP rights got ripped to 1,000 pieces through a series of mergers and acquisitions.
Not murders. Merger.
Yes, I got mergers. Got it.
Anyways, I feel,
They're kind of the same sometimes.
like that series never got like is tacked into as it deserved. Not my style of writing though. I just want to see it come back.
As indie game developers, is there sort of like big picture things that you'd want to see like the game industry like push forward in terms of like telling more unique stories and exploring more, I guess, like experimental gameplay at large?
I think the main thing I want from the game industry, and this is like just such a modern cultural thing, all of the capital has been dangerously concentrated in projects that become too big to fail. And I think that the industry as a whole needs to stop putting hundreds of millions of dollars into individual AAA releases and just like better fund slews of smaller projects. And like there are challenges there, right? Like games are a very hit-driven industry for indie publishers. Their top one performing game will fund everything else, which will operate at a loss. And there are things to unpack there, but I think it's like where the industry is in this very dangerous place right now, where I adored Alan Wake 2. Very glad that game got to be made. Loved the DLC that dropped a couple weeks ago, but like it cost $100 million to make that game. And, you know, Epic funded it, bully for them. And generally you spend 50% or 100% of your development budget on marketing. So, like, let's be real, it's closer to like $150 to $200 million. Game did not make a profit, despite like sweeping awards shows, despite being pretty popular. And it's just like, how are we at a state where it's like AAA games require that much money, and then even by normal metrics of success, like normal sales numbers, they just don't even break even.
Like with Slay the Princess, so much of the game came from the limitations that we placed on it, because we knew we couldn't spend forever on it. We knew that we had time limitations. We knew that we had work limitations on it based around our other project. So just those limitations alone were something that added to the game itself. Like having limitations can be a huge boon to you, and having limitless money is not actually true. Like no one has limitless money. And it just means you can keep throwing money at things and saying, let's make the graphics even more realistic, even though we don't need
that. And that I think is one of the biggest things. It's the endless pursuit of fidelity.
Yeah.
It's the endless pursuit of like monopolizing all of your players' times, where it's like,
yeah, you can spend 70 hours staring into somebody's facial pores.
That's a AAA game that barely passes the $1 per hour ratio that Steam gamers feel is like the baseline there, right? It's
we gotta cut them off.
You know,
They had too much time with games.
We hit a point where it's like the next Assassin's Creed drops, and the expectations are, well, this is $60, so I should be able to get, call it 150 hours out of it, maybe 400 if I'm platinuming it.
Because I paid $60 for this other game that gave me 120 hours. So that's the new standard.
Yeah. And then, like, on top of all of this, it needs this, like, photorealistic visual fidelity where, I think there's this meme going around on Twitter, like, a couple months ago, where it was, like, hyper zoomed in on, like, the eyes and pores of like current gen characters, and it's like, who is zooming in close to Aloy's face that like whether or not sweat leaves a specific pore is like a necessary part of the gameplay experience.
And they're definitely not zooming in on almost most gaming rigs, you know, like the smaller ones, because they can't, because the graphics are so much that like the monsters loading into the map take too much for them to be able to see those beautiful pores. Anyway, but this is all to say that adding limitations can be a really good thing, and pushing for constant just upwards forever and ever and ever is not doable. We should all know that at this point. Like the line does not go on forever.
I think Nintendo is like the only platform holder that really figured it out, where it's like once you hit the like Switch to PS4 range of graphics, you get diminishing returns for additional spend there. So just make something stylized. Just lean into something that's visually and artistically unique and still fantastic.
Because it's an art form, and yearning for realism in an art form is not always the way to go. Like, abstract is beautiful, surreal is beautiful. Like, you can lean into the fact that it is an art, and you don't have to base it around an actor's face.
Right. Or we can just all give in and everyone can go the way of mobile and exclusively make gacha games.
Oh, God.
A great avenue to announce that while Slay the Princess, the Pristine Cut will be free to play, we will be introducing loot boxes where you'll have to spend about $200 in princess points to get a guaranteed 5-star root drop to unlock each of them.
Tony's joking.
I'm joking.
I know. Oh no, I knew you were joking. Sorry. I was like, how's that gonna work? Oh man. No, I mean I agree with like so much of what you said. It's just yeah, I think the pursuit of like graphical fidelity, it just causes so many problems. Like obviously like it just makes the money and the budget skyrocket, but also it takes away from putting creative effort into making like more unique gameplay. Because I feel like all the games that have like that strive for that like the next best wave of graphics, usually gameplay wise they're basically doing whatever all the other third person action adventure games are doing, and maybe they'll add a few mechanics, they'll mix in things from a few other games, but I feel like the games that really push things forward in terms of like a completely unique experience, a lot of times the graphics are they look good, but they might be simpler. Like I played Animal Well recently and that was fantastic.
10 megabytes or whatever.
Yeah, that was the best part. Yeah, I downloaded in like a millisecond.
But it's like in the modern world's ceaseless pursuit of line go up, it is lost sight of what made line go up to begin with.
Wow.
It's a soundbite.
There you
go right there. I think we have to stop right there. It's a perfect ending point. Thank you so much. I think that was great. That was all the questions I had. Was there anything else that you really wanted to mention or talk about that we didn't touch on?
Gosh, I don't know.
I think we covered it.
Save the review cinema in Toronto.
Oh yeah,
from its greedy landlord shutting it down.
Oh no.
That's our thing of the day.
It's a cultural icon.
It is. We only got to go once. I want to go more often. It's very good. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I agree. I love going to the movies.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, Tony and Abby, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. I think this was a great interview, and I really appreciate it.
Sweet.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having us. This is wonderful.
Oh, no, my pleasure.